That night, a forgotten mail-order bride had no supper until the cowboy shared his plate. Sometimes the Lord puts folks in our path just when we need them most. Back in 1882, in a little frontier town called Cedar Ridge, two lonely souls were about to discover that the simplest acts of Christian kindness can bloom into something far more precious than either could have imagined. The evening shadows stretched long across the weathered porch of Braddock's Mercantile, where Eleanora Summerfield sat with her back pressed against the rough-hewn planks. Her fingers traced the dented rim of an empty tin cup, counting the same 3 pennies in her worn leather coin purse for what felt like the 100th time that day. The coins clinked softly together, not near enough for even a piece of hard tack. Through the amber glow of the store's kerosene lamps, she could see Mrs. Braddock arranging bolts of calico on the counter, occasionally glancing toward the window with a disapproving shake of her graying head. Eleanora straightened her shoulders and smoothed the wrinkles from her faded blue dress, determined to maintain whatever dignity the good Lord had left her after 3 long days of waiting for a man who clearly was not coming. She had been a school teacher once. Back in Ridgemont, Ohio, Miss Summerfield had stood before 23 children every morning with chalk dust on her fingers and Shakespeare on her tongue. She had taught them their letters and their numbers, had wiped their tears and straightened their collars, had loved every single one of them as though they were her own. Then Aldrich happened. Mr. Gerald Aldrich. The school superintendent with his pomade-slicked hair and his wandering hands, who cornered her after the autumn recital and told her she was too pretty to waste her evenings alone. When she refused him, when she stepped back and said no sir with a voice that did not waver, he smiled the kind of smile that makes a woman's blood run cold. 2 weeks later, the school board received an anonymous letter accusing Miss Summerfield of stealing from the education fund. $37, they said. Enough to ruin a reputation that had taken years to build. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. Eleanora stood before 5 men in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old decisions, and not one of them looked her in the eye. Her colleagues who had shared bread with her at the teacher's table sat in the gallery and studied their shoes. Her students were forbidden from attending. Only her older sister Margaret believed her, and Margaret's belief could not pay rent or restore a name that had been dragged through the mud of a small town's gossip. It was Margaret who scraped together the money for the train ticket west. Margaret who found the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Ogden Hale of Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory. Rancher, God-fearing, seeking a bride of good moral character and practical skills. The letters had been proper enough. Polite, promising. Eleanora had written back with careful penmanship and careful hope, describing her education, her cooking, her willingness to work hard in a new land. Hale's replies came on time, each one offering reassurance like stones laid across a river, steady enough to walk on if you did not look down. She should have looked down. 3 days now. The train had delivered her to Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon, and she had stepped onto the platform with her single traveling bag and her heart hammering with the particular terror of a woman who has staked everything on a stranger's word. The platform was empty. No Ogden Hale. No explanation. No message left at the station office or the post office or the mercantile. Just the wind picking up dust from the street and carrying it nowhere. The main street of Cedar Ridge bustled with the day's final activities. Ranchers loaded supplies into their farm wagons. Children chased each other between the hitching posts, and the saloon across the way had already begun to fill with cowhands finished with their work. Eleanora watched it all from her shadowed corner, invisible to most folks passing by, just another piece of frontier furniture that had seen considerably better days. Her stomach twisted with a familiar pang, and she pressed her hand against the worn fabric of her dress to quiet the rumbling. When she reckoned no one was looking, she lifted the tin cup to her lips and licked away the morning dewdrops that had collected on its surface. The tiny drops of moisture provided mighty little relief, but they were free as air. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 full days. The last of her bread had gone stale on the second morning, and she had chewed it slowly, making each bite last, washing it down with water from the public pump behind the livery stable. Pride kept her from begging. Pride in the memory of standing before that school board with her chin raised and her voice steady, refusing to grovel for men who had already decided her fate before she opened her mouth. She would not beg then. She would not beg now. Across the dusty thoroughfare, Jedediah Colburn dismounted from his bay gelding with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his 28 years in the saddle. He looped the reins around the hitching post and brushed the trail dust from his leather chaps, his attention caught by the slight figure huddled on Braddock's porch. Something about the woman's careful posture, the way she held herself upright despite her obvious distress, made him pause mid-step. He had seen plenty of folks down on their luck in frontier towns. The territory was full of broken promises and empty pockets. But there was a quiet dignity about this one that spoke of better circumstances not so long past. The kind of dignity that comes not from wealth or position, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that hardship cannot reach unless you let it. Jed knew something about holding on. He had been doing it himself for the better part of a year, ever since the fever took his brother Emmett in the dead of winter. The guilt of that night sat in his chest like a stone he had swallowed whole, too large to digest, too deep to reach. He had not spoken of it to anyone, not to his mother, not to Winifred, not to the God he still believed in despite everything. Lenora became aware of his scrutiny and lifted her chin, meeting his gaze across the street with eyes that held no shame, only a bone-deep weariness that seemed far too heavy for someone who appeared to be barely past 20. Jed touched the brim of his hat in a respectful nod before turning toward the mercantile's entrance. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scents of leather, tobacco, and pickle brine. Mrs. Braddock looked up from her inventory with the practiced smile of a shopkeeper who knew every customer's business and most of their secrets. "Evening, Jed. What brings you to town so late?" "Need some supplies, Mrs. Braddock." He glanced toward the window where Lenora sat, her silhouette dark against the fading sky. "And I am fixing to get 2 bowls of that beef stew you keep warm in the back. Extra cornbread if you have got it to spare." The older woman's eyebrows rose as she followed his gaze. "Expecting company for supper?" Jed simply nodded toward the window and placed 30 cents on the counter. More than fair payment for 2 simple meals in a territory where money stretched thin and Christian kindness stretched even thinner. Mrs. Braddock studied his face for a moment, then turned toward the back room without another word. When she returned with 2 ceramic bowls wrapped in cloth and a generous portion of cornbread, she set them on the counter with a gentleness that contradicted her usual brisk efficiency. She had been watching that girl on her porch for 3 days, and the relief she felt at someone finally doing something about it showed in the softening around her mouth, though she would have denied it if asked. Steam rose from the ceramic bowls as Jed stepped onto the porch. The rich scent of beef and onions cut through the evening air like a promise. Lenora's stomach betrayed her with a growl so loud it might have been heard clear across the street, and she pressed her lips together tight enough to turn them white. He set 1 bowl on the weathered planks between them and lowered himself to sit a respectful 3 feet away, close enough to share the meal, far enough to preserve her dignity. The cornbread wrapped in checkered cloth followed with a soft thump. I cannot. Lenora's voice caught like a fishhook in her throat. Did not ask for payment. Jed unwrapped his own portion, steam fogging the air between them. Lenora stared at the bowl. The broth caught the lamplight from inside the store, golden and thick with chunks of meat and carrots and potatoes that glistened with rendered fat. Her hands trembled as she lifted the wooden spoon, the carved handle smooth against her palm. The first taste made her eyes flutter closed. Salt and pepper and bay leaves, the deep richness of slow-cooked beef. She had to force herself to eat slowly, to savor rather than devour, though every instinct screamed at her to empty the bowl in desperate gulps. They ate without speaking. Jed broke his cornbread into careful pieces, soaking them in the broth. Lenora watched his hands, calloused from rope work, scarred along the knuckles where barbed wire had left its mark, but steady and sure as a stone wall. Ogden Hale never came. The words escaped before she could catch them. 3 days now. Jed nodded, chewing thoughtfully. A piece of cornbread crumbled between his fingers. Had promises broken myself. Hurts different than other kinds of pain. The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying campfire. Lenora scraped the last of the broth from her bowl, reluctant to let the meal end. Her stomach had stopped its gnawing complaints. But the warmth spreading through her chest had nothing to do with the food. Why? She asked. Jed wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and studied her face in the flickering light. Same reason you kept your dignity sitting on this porch instead of begging door to door. Mrs. Braddock appeared in the doorway, keys jingling in her weathered hand. Closing up now, folks. The metal keys caught the lamplight as she turned them in the lock with a decisive click. Lenora's breath caught in her throat as the reality settled over her. The store was closed. The street was emptying. The church bells had already chimed 7, and she had nowhere to go. Jed rose to his feet, brushing crumbs from his pants. He looked down at Lenora, still sitting with her empty bowl, and she saw something shift in his expression, a decision forming behind his weathered features. My family's ranch needs help with preserving season, he said quietly. Room and board for honest work. Lenora looked up at him, searching his face for the catch that had to be there somewhere. She had learned to search for catches the way other women searched for bargains, with desperate thoroughness and the expectation of disappointment. Just work. The words scraped her throat raw. Nothing else expected. My mother runs the house. She will set the terms, not me. The honesty in his voice made Lenora's chest tighten like a drawstring pouch. She had heard such promises before, written in letters perfumed with false sweetness and signed with flourishes that meant less than nothing. But this man's calloused hands and sun-weathered skin spoke of labor, not lies. She rose on unsteady legs. I can cook, clean, mend proper. Used to teach school, back in Ohio before. She let the sentence die like smoke on the wind. Jed nodded toward his bay gelding. Farm wagon is around back. The horse stamped and snorted as they approached, leather harness creaking with each movement. Lenora's single traveling bag sat light in her hands, everything she owned in this world fitting into one worn valise with brass corner fittings. Jed took it from her without asking and secured it under the canvas cover with practiced efficiency. The wagon seat creaked as she settled beside him, the sound sharp in the evening air. The quilted lap blanket he handed her smelled of wood smoke and prairie sage, scents that spoke of home fires and wide open spaces. Jed clicked his tongue, and the horse stepped forward into the gathering darkness. Cedar Ridge fell away behind them, its scattered lights growing small and distant like fallen stars. "Why help me?" Leonora's breath made small white clouds in the cooling air. Jed adjusted the leather reins in his gloved hands. "Reckon we all need someone to offer a plate when the world forgets we are hungry." The answer settled something loose in Leonora's chest, something that had been rattling around like a broken hinge since the day Aldrich smiled that terrible smile. "My brother died of fever last winter," Jed said, his voice barely audible over the creak of wheels and harness leather. "Family has been struggling since. Ma and my sister-in-law Winifred worked themselves near to death trying to keep up with preserving and the household work." Leonora heard the weight in his words. Not self-pity, but the simple statement of a man carrying more than his fair share. "I am sorry for your loss." Jed nodded once, sharp and final. The wagon rolled through a shallow creek, water splashing between the wooden spokes with a sound like scattered coins. Leonora gripped the seat as they climbed the far bank, her body swaying with each bump. Above them, the Milky Way spread like scattered flour across black canvas. "This arrangement," Leonora said carefully, testing each word like a woman walking across a frozen pond. "It is temporary. Understood." But something in the way he said it made her glance at his profile. His jaw was set firm as granite, and his hands held the reins with the confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was heading and why. In the distance, yellow light flickered between dark shapes that gradually resolved into buildings. A farmhouse, a barn, outbuildings arranged around a central yard. Smoke rose straight from the chimney in the still air, carrying the scent of burning oak. Split log construction, a wide porch, windows glowing with warm kerosene light. It looked solid, permanent, nothing like the tent cities and ramshackle boarding houses she had grown accustomed to during her journey west. The horses' hooves changed rhythm as they turned into the yard, shifting from the hollow thump of hard-packed road to the softer sound of barnyard earth. Leonora's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Through the kitchen window, she could see the silhouette of a woman moving with quick, efficient gestures. A coffee pot sat on the stove, steam rising from its spout. Dishes clinked as someone cleared supper. The kitchen door opened, spilling golden light across the porch boards. Dorothea Colburn stood in the doorway like a sentinel, gray hair pinned back severe as winter, weathered hands gripping a dish rag that had seen better decades. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of her face as she studied Leonora with the measuring look of a woman who had survived 40 years on the frontier by trusting her instincts over pretty words. "Ma, this is Leonora Summerfield," Jed said, helping Leonora down from the wagon with a steadying hand. "She needs work, and we need help with preserving season." Dorothea's eyes traveled from Leonora's worn traveling dress to the single valise in Jed's hands, cataloging everything with the thoroughness of a livestock appraiser at a county fair. "Can you make bread that will not break teeth?" The blunt question caught Leonora off guard. "Yes, ma'am, I believe so." Believing and doing are two different things entirely. Dorothea turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving the door open behind her. "Come on then. Let us see what you are made of." The kitchen smelled of lye soap and yesterday's biscuits, with undertones of wood smoke from the cast iron stove that dominated one wall like a black iron throne. A younger woman with auburn hair twisted into a practical bun looked up from washing dishes, her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her forearms pink from the hot water. "This is Winifred, my daughter-in-law," Dorothea said without preamble. "Winifred, this is Leonora. She will be helping with the work." Winifred dried her hands on her apron and offered a smile that reached her tired eyes. "Welcome, Leonora. I hope you do not mind jumping right in." Tomorrow is washing day, and we have got preserving to start." Lenora nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The normality of it all, the domestic routine, the assumption that she belonged here, made her chest ache with something she was afraid to name. Dorothea opened a wooden crock and examined the sourdough starter inside, poking it with a clean finger. "This needs tending. You ever worked with starter before?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother kept one for 20 years back in Ohio." "Good." Dorothea pushed the crock toward Lenora. "Mix it proper and set it by the stove. We will see how your bread turns out come morning." Lenora rolled up her sleeves and set to work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she stirred the mixture, adding flour and water in the proportions her mother had taught her before the consumption took her voice and then the rest of her. The starter bubbled and frothed, alive and healthy, reminding her of better times when bread making was a comfort rather than a test. She wiped the rim of the crock clean and covered it with a damp cloth, tucking the edges just so. Dorothea watched every movement with eyes that missed nothing. When Lenora finished, the older woman gave a barely perceptible nod, the kind of approval that had to be earned with actions, not asked for with words. "Winifred, show her to the back room. She can sleep there tonight." The back room was small but clean, a narrow bed covered by a hand-stitched quilt in shades of blue and white, a wash basin on a wooden stand, a bar of soap in a china dish, pegs on the wall for hanging clothes, a window that looked out toward the barn and the dark fields beyond. Lenora set her valise on the bed and turned to find Winifred standing in the doorway with a candle, her face soft in its glow. "Do not mind Dorothea," Winifred said quietly. "She has been running this place single-handed since my husband died. Takes her time warming up to new folks." "I understand. I am grateful for any chance to prove myself." Winifred's expression softened further. "You look dead on your feet. There is clean water in the pitcher and soap in the dish. Rest up. Tomorrow comes early on a working ranch." After Winifred left, Lenora sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence wash over her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of voices in the kitchen. Dorothea and Jed discussing something in low tones. She caught fragments carried through the gaps in the plank walls. Dorothea's voice, tight as wire. "Cannot afford another mouth to feed, Jedediah. Not with Morrison already pressing us about the feed account." And Jed's reply, steady as the heartbeat of the earth itself. "Give her a chance, Ma. That is all I am asking." A longer silence. Then Dorothea, "1 week. If her bread is good and her work is honest, we will talk again. If not, she goes." Lenora's stomach clenched around the meal that had been her first real food in 2 days. She pulled writing paper from her valise and dipped the steel pen in the small bottle of ink she carried. "Dear Maggie, I have found employment with a family named Colburn near Cedar Ridge. The work is honest and the people seem decent. Too soon to say more than that, but I wanted you to know I am safe and have shelter. Your sister, Lenora." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her reticule to post when next she got to town. Outside her window, an owl hooted in the darkness, its call lonely and wild. Lenora blew out the candle and lay back on the narrow bed, still fully dressed. The quilt smelled of lavender and honest work, reminding her of home in ways that made her throat tighten. She was drifting toward sleep when footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. The back door opened and closed with a soft click. Through her window, she could see Jed walking toward the barn, his shoulders set with the weight of whatever Dorothea had said to him. He walked the way men walk when they are carrying something invisible but heavy, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Halfway to the barn, he stopped, turned back toward the house, his face tilted up as if searching the windows. For a moment, Eleanora thought he was looking directly at her room, though she knew the darkness would hide her from view. The moonlight caught the lines of his face, and she saw something there she recognized. The same expression she had seen in her own mirror on the morning she left Ohio. The look of someone wondering whether the choice they just made would save them or destroy them. Then he continued toward the barn, and Eleanora was left wondering what tomorrow would bring and whether she would be here to see it. She closed her eyes, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The bed was narrow and the pillow thin, but it was the first real bed she had slept in since leaving Ohio, and the warmth of it wrapped around her like a kindness she had almost forgotten how to receive. But as sleep finally reached for her, one question burned in her mind, like a brand pressed against bare skin. What exactly had Dorothea Colburn said to make her son walk away with such heavy steps? And what would happen when the week was up, and Leonora's bread and her work, and her very presence in this house were weighed on the scale of a woman who trusted instincts over pretty words? The answer, she knew, would determine everything. Whether she had found a temporary shelter or a permanent home. Whether Cedar Ridge would be another stop on a journey that led nowhere, or the place where Eleanora Summerfield finally stopped running from a world that had already taken everything except the one thing she refused to surrender, her dignity. And somewhere in the darkness outside her window, a cowboy stood in a barn doorway, looking up at the stars and wondering the very same thing. Hands working, hearts watching. The rooster crowed before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, its cry sharp and insistent in the gray light of early morning. Eleanora was already awake. She had slept in fragments, her body grateful for the narrow bed, but her mind refusing to quiet. Turning over the fragments of conversation she had heard through the thin walls, like a woman examining coins in poor light, trying to determine their worth. 1 week. That was what Dorothea had given her. 7 days to prove that her hands were worth the food they would consume and the space they would occupy in a household already stretched thin by grief and economics. She dressed quickly in the dim room, smoothing her hair into a tight bun with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to make herself presentable without mirrors or vanity. Her faded blue dress had been brushed clean the night before, and she had mended the small tear along the hem with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Small things. But Eleanora had learned that in the economy of first impressions, small things were the currency that mattered most. The kitchen was already warm when she entered. Dorothea stood at the cast-iron stove, feeding it split oak with the precision of someone who understood that fire, like people, required exactly the right amount of fuel. Not too much, not too little. The older woman glanced at Eleanora without greeting, her eyes dropping to the younger woman's hands as if checking whether they were ready for work. Eleanora went straight to the sourdough crock without being told. She lifted the damp cloth and examined the starter, noting with satisfaction the healthy bubbles that covered its surface like tiny promises. The yeast was alive and active, ready to do its work. She began measuring flour into the large mixing bowl, her movements sure and rhythmic, the way her mother had taught her in the kitchen of their Ohio farmhouse when Eleanora was barely tall enough to reach the counter. You do not wait to be told what needs doing. Eleanora looked up. Dorothea was watching her with an expression that was not quite approval, but was several degrees warmer than the frost of the night before. No, ma'am. My mother always said that a woman who waits to be asked has already fallen behind. Something flickered in Dorothea's eyes. A recognition, perhaps, of a philosophy she shared but rarely heard spoken aloud by anyone under 40. She said nothing more, but she moved aside slightly at the stove, making room for Eleanora to access the bread pans that hung on hooks above the warming shelf. It was a small gesture, a few inches of space, but in the language of Dorothea Colburn's kitchen, it was the equivalent of an open door. By the time the sun had fully risen, painting the kitchen windows with amber light, 3 loaves of bread sat cooling on the wooden rack. Their crusts were golden brown and even, the interiors soft and properly risen, and when Dorothea broke one open with her weathered hands, the steam that escaped carried the sweet, yeasty fragrance that is the oldest comfort known to hungry people. The older woman chewed a piece slowly, her jaw working with the deliberate patience of someone who takes the act of judgment seriously. Then she set the remaining piece on her plate and looked at Eleanora with eyes that had gone from measuring to something closer to acknowledgement. "Your mother taught you well." 3 words, but Eleanora felt them land in her chest with the weight of a verdict, and she had to turn away toward the window to keep Dorothea from seeing the shine in her eyes. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady and predictable as the heartbeat of the ranch itself. Eleanora rose before dawn and went to bed after the last lamp was extinguished, filling the hours between with work that left her hands raw and her muscles aching, but her spirit strangely lighter than it had been in months. She learned the geography of the Colburn Ranch the way a cartographer learns a new territory, by walking every inch of it. The root cellar with its cool stone walls and shelves lined with empty mason jars waiting to be filled. The smokehouse where strips of venison hung like leather curtains, slowly curing in the fragrant haze. The chicken coop where 14 hens produced eggs with the reliable industry of factory workers, and the kitchen garden where the last tomatoes of the season clung to their withering vines like old women refusing to let go of summer. She gathered eggs each morning, her fingers gentle around the warm shells, and carried them to town twice a week in a basket padded with clean straw. Mrs. Braddock bought them all without haggling, and if the shopkeeper occasionally added an extra penny or two to the payment, neither woman remarked upon it. Some kindnesses are best left unexamined, like wounds that heal faster when you stop picking at the bandage. Winifred became her companion in the daily work, the 2 women falling into an easy partnership that surprised them both. Where Eleanora was precise and methodical, Winifred was quick and intuitive, and together they moved through the preserving work with an efficiency that left even Dorothea grudgingly impressed. They peeled apples side by side at the kitchen table, the long curls of skin falling into the slop bucket in spirals of red and green. They boiled jars and sealed lids and labeled each one with the date and contents in Eleanora's careful schoolteacher script. Dorothea was different before Emmett passed, Winifred said one afternoon, her voice soft beneath the rhythmic thump of the apple peeler. She used to sing while she cooked. Can you imagine? Old hymns, mostly. And sometimes the folk songs her mother brought over from the old country. The house felt different then, fuller, somehow, even though there were the same number of people living in it. Eleanora could imagine it. She had already begun to see the ghost outlines of the woman Dorothea had been before grief stripped her down to wire and bone and willpower. It showed in unexpected moments. The way Dorothea's hand lingered on the family Bible before she put it back on the shelf. The way she kept Emmett's coffee mug on its hook in the kitchen, unwashed, as though he might walk in any morning and reach for it. She is testing you, Winifred continued, glancing toward the door to make sure they were alone. Not just your cooking and your work. She is watching to see if you are the kind of woman who stays when things get hard. She has had enough of people leaving. The words settled into Eleanora's bones with the weight of understanding. She knew that test. She had been taking it her whole life. It was during the second week that Lenora first found herself alone with Jed in the root cellar, sorting the last of the Gravenstein apples for winter storage. The cellar smelled of earth and fruit, cool air rising from the stone-lined pit like breath from a sleeping animal. Kerosene light danced on the walls, casting their shadows large and strange against the rough stone. Jed carried a wooden crate down the narrow steps, his boots scraping against the packed dirt floor. He set the box near the sorting table with a solid thump, and Lenora lifted the lamp higher to examine the fruit. Good ones for storage, damaged ones for immediate use or cider pressing. Her fingers moved with the quick assessment of someone who understood that winter survival depended on decisions made in autumn. She reached for a basket at the same moment he did. Their fingers brushed against the woven rim, rough calluses meeting soft skin. Both hands stilled. Lenora felt the warmth of his touch spread up her arm, her pulse jumping beneath her wrist. Jed pulled his hand back first, the basket creaking as it settled. "You have done this before." Lenora picked up an apple, testing its firmness with her thumb. "Ohio farm. Before teaching took me to town." They worked in silence for a while, their movements falling into rhythm without discussion, like dancers who had practiced the steps in separate rooms and only now discovered they knew the same music. Jed sorted with a careful efficiency that spoke of years handling things that bruised easily. Livestock, fruit, his own unspoken grief. "Winter is coming early this year," he said, examining a particularly large Gravenstein. "All the signs point that way." "What signs?" "Woolly caterpillars thicker than usual, squirrels gathering 2 weeks ahead of normal, horses growing their winter coats already, and it is barely September." He placed the apple in the good basket with careful precision. "Ma taught me to read such things when I was knee-high to a grasshopper." The mention of his mother sent a flutter through Lenora's chest. Dorothea Colburn had been watching her all week, measuring her worth through bread that rose properly, and stew that did not burn, and floors that were swept before being asked. Lenora sensed something shifting in the older woman's assessment, a thawing so gradual it could be mistaken for imagination, but she did not dare assume anything permanent. Lenora's sleeve caught on a protruding nail. The fabric tore with a soft ripping sound that seemed loud in the enclosed space. A 3-inch tear along the seam of her work dress, the only one she had for daily use. "Here." Jed pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, the cotton soft and worn from many washings. His fingers brushed her wrist as he helped tie the cloth around the tear, and Lenora caught the scent of his skin. Lye soap and leather, and something warm beneath it that made her breath catch. The cellar door creaked above them. "Jedediah, you down there?" Dorothea's voice carried a note of inquiry that suggested she knew exactly where her son was and with whom he was spending his time. "Yes, Ma. Sorting the last of the Gravensteins." "Supper is ready. Both of you come up and wash before the food gets cold." "Both of you." The simple inclusion in Dorothea's call carried more weight than a written invitation. They climbed the steps together, Jed holding the lamp to light Lenora's way. At the top, he held out his hand to help her navigate the final step. She hesitated, then placed her palm in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and sure, and released them the moment her feet found solid ground. In the kitchen, the table was set for 4. Not 3, with an extra plate added as an afterthought, but 4, as though there had always been 4 and always would be. Lenora noticed, but said nothing. Some gifts are too fragile to acknowledge aloud. The following day, Jed asked her opinion about expanding the chicken coop. They were standing at the hand pump outside the kitchen door, washing up before supper, and he mentioned it casually, as though consulting her about ranch decisions were the most natural thing in the world. Thinking about adding maybe a dozen more hens before winter sets in proper. Lenora blinked at him, water dripping from her chin. He was asking her opinion as if she had a permanent stake in this place, as if her thoughts mattered to the future of this ranch and these people. "More eggs for preserving," she said slowly, working through the implications. "And chickens for meat through the cold months. Makes good sense." "That is what I figured too." The approval in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. She dried her hands on the towel, aware of his presence beside her in the gathering dusk, of the way his shoulder nearly brushed hers as they stood side by side at the pump. Then the sound of hoofbeats shattered the quiet like a rock through glass. A horse drummed against the hard-packed earth of the yard, the sound growing louder as the rider approached. Lenora turned to see a man silhouetted against the last light of sunset, sitting his mount with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in any room he entered. His hat was pulled low, but even in the fading light, she could see the sharp lines of a face built for intimidation rather than comfort. Jed stepped closer to Lenora, his body tensing. The easy companionship of the moment before evaporated like morning dew in August heat. "That is Virgil Skaggs," he said, his voice flat. The name meant nothing to Lenora, but the way Jed said it made her stomach clench. Skaggs reined his horse to a stop near the porch and touched his hat brim with a mockery of politeness, his eyes finding Lenora and lingering with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "Evening, Colburn. Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride." Lenora felt the blood drain from her face. Before Jed could speak, Lenora straightened her spine and met Skaggs's gaze with the same directness she had used with every bully she had ever faced. "I am a worker here, Mr. Skaggs. Nothing more than that." Skaggs's horse shifted beneath him, hooves scraping against the earth. His eyes never left Lenora's face. "That Ogden Hale fellow has been talking around town. Says you ran out on your wedding contract. Left him high and dry after he paid good money for your passage west." Lenora's jaw clenched until her teeth ached. She could taste copper where she had bitten her tongue. "Lenora's business is her own concern," Jed said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of warning a wise man would heed. The kitchen door opened behind them. Dorothea emerged, wiping her hands on her apron with sharp movements. Her gray eyes took in the scene with the quick assessment of a woman who knew trouble when it rode into her yard. "Mr. Skaggs, what brings you calling at supper time when decent folks are sitting down with their families?" "Just being neighborly, Mrs. Colburn. Wanted to meet the young lady who has caused such a stir in town." Dorothea positioned herself beside Lenora, presenting a united front. "Lenora has been a blessing to this household. Works harder than most men I have had the pleasure of knowing." Skaggs smiled, but it did not reach his eyes, which remained cold as creek stones in winter. "I am sure she does. Question is, what kind of work exactly?" The insult hit Lenora like a slap. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her chin raised. "The kind that puts food on the table and keeps a house running proper, Mr. Skaggs. Perhaps you should ask your wife about such things, assuming you have one who will claim you." Skaggs's face darkened. "My wife knows her place, girl." "Then she is fortunate to have found it so easily. Not all of us are blessed with such clarity." Tension crackled between Jed and Skaggs like the air before a thunderstorm. Then Skaggs touched his hat with exaggerated courtesy that fooled no one. "Sure enough. Just remember, Colburn, actions have consequences in a community like ours, especially when they affect the reputation of decent, God-fearing folks. He wheeled his horse and spurred it into a gallop, dust rising behind him in clouds that drifted across the yard in the still air. The sound of hooves faded, leaving behind only crickets and cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. Leonora's hands shook as she stood in the silence that followed. A moth fluttered against the kitchen window glass, drawn to the warm glow inside. "Do not let him rattle you," Dorothea said firmly. But Leonora could see the worry lines deepening around the older woman's eyes. Virgil Skaggs has been a troublemaker since he was knee-high. But beneath the brave words, Leonora saw calculation happening behind Dorothea's weathered features. The older woman's fingers worried at the strings of her apron. "He is not wrong, though," Leonora said quietly, "about contracts and consequences." Jed turned to face her. "You do not owe Ogden Hale a blessed thing. He broke faith first when he left you sitting on that porch." Inside the house, Winifred called that supper was getting cold, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone pretending that the world outside the kitchen door was not closing in. Dorothea touched Leonora's shoulder gently before heading toward the door, brief but warm. "We chose to keep you. We stand by that choice, come what may." But as the older woman disappeared into the golden light of the kitchen, Leonora caught the tightness around her mouth, the slight stoop of shoulders carrying a burden that had not been there an hour before. The days after Skaggs's visit brought consequences as steadily and surely as autumn brought frost. Jake Morrison at the feed store was the first to turn. When Dorothea went to town for the monthly supplies, he met her at the counter with his arms crossed and his voice pitched loud enough for every customer in the store to hear. "Decent customers do not want to do business with folks who harbor fallen women, Mrs. Colburn. Bad for a man's reputation to be seen dealing with such arrangements." Leonora was not there to witness it, but she heard about it that evening from Winifred, who had gone along to help carry packages and returned with her face white and her lips pressed into a thin line. Dorothea said nothing about the encounter. She simply set the meager supplies on the kitchen counter and began unpacking them with hands that moved a little too quickly, a little too roughly, as though the tins and sacks had done her some personal offense. Sunday at church was worse. The Cedar Ridge Community Church was a small white building with a bell tower and windows that let in more dust than light. Leonora walked in with the Colburns, wearing her best dress and her straightest spine, and felt the congregation shift like a single organism turning to examine a foreign body. Whispers traveled from pew to pew faster than the hymnal pages could turn. The pastor avoided Leonora's eyes during his sermon about charity and Christian fellowship, which under the circumstances struck her as a cruelty more refined than anything Skaggs could have devised. Mrs. Braddock was one of the few who acknowledged Leonora with a nod and a small, deliberate smile. Old Mr. Fenwick, who was half-deaf and entirely unconcerned with gossip, shook her hand after the service and told her she looked like his granddaughter, which Leonora chose to take as a compliment. On the wagon ride home from church, Dorothea sat rigid beside Leonora, her jaw set and her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence was so thick it had weight, pressing down on all of them like the low gray clouds that had gathered during the service. Then, without turning her head, Dorothea spoke. "Do you know why I kept you, Leonora?" Leonora shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Because your bread reminds me of my mother's, and because my son smiled for the first time since Emmett died the morning after you arrived." The older woman climbed down from the wagon and walked into the kitchen, closing the door behind her. Leonora sat in the yard with Dorothea's words ringing in her ears, and her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall where anyone could see them. It was Mrs. Braddock, who changed everything. Lenora had gone to the mercantile on a Tuesday to sell eggs, the basket heavy against her hip as she walked the 3 miles to town in the sharp morning air. Mrs. Braddock counted the eggs with her usual efficiency, placed the coins in Lenora's palm, and then leaned across the counter with the conspiratorial posture of a woman who has kept a secret long enough to feel its weight. "I need to tell you something, Miss Summerfield. Something I should have told you the first night you sat on my porch." Lenora's fingers closed around the coins. "Ma'am?" Mrs. Braddock glanced toward the door, then back at Lenora. 2 years ago, another girl came to Cedar Ridge. Mail-order bride, same as you. Same arrangement. Same man. Ogden Hale." The coins bit into Lenora's palm. "What happened to her?" "She sat on my porch for 5 days. 5. I gave her water and a blanket, but I did not do more. I told myself it was not my business." Mrs. Braddock's voice tightened like wet leather drying in the sun. "Hale showed up on the 6th day, took her away in his wagon. I never saw her again. Heard she left town, but nobody saw her leave. Nobody could say where she went." She reached beneath the counter and produced a small leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon and turned it toward Lenora. There, in Mrs. Braddock's neat shopkeeper script, was a name and a date. Mary Thorne. March 14th, 1880. Purchased needle and thread. 1 spool white cotton, 1 cake of soap. "That is the last record I have of her," Mrs. Braddock said. "The last proof she was ever here at all." Lenora stared at the entry. The handwriting was matter-of-fact, the transaction mundane. A woman buying supplies for a life she was about to begin, or a life she was about to lose. The ordinary made terrible by what came after. "I have been carrying that weight for 2 years," Mrs. Braddock continued. "I will not carry it again. Be careful, Miss Summerfield. Ogden Hale is not what he appears to be." Lenora left the mercantile with the egg money in her pocket and Mrs. Braddock's words burning in her mind. She did not go directly back to the ranch. Instead, she walked to the county records office, a single room in the back of the territorial courthouse where a clerk named Patterson kept files in wooden cabinets that smelled of dust and old decisions. She told Patterson she was researching property records for the Colburn Ranch, which was true enough to satisfy a man who asked few questions and answered fewer. While he retrieved the files she had requested, she found what she was actually looking for in the 3rd cabinet from the left. Marriage contracts, filed by date. Alphabetical by groom, Hale, Ogden. She found 2 entries. The first was dated February 1880, a mail-order bride contract with Mary Thorne of Baltimore, Maryland. The terms were standard except for one clause buried in the 4th paragraph, written in legal language dense enough to hide a sin. In the event that the bride abandons the arrangement prior to the completion of 1 year of domestic service, she shall be liable for the full cost of transportation, lodging, and sundry expenses incurred by the groom, said debt to be satisfied through labor at a rate determined by the groom. Labor at a rate determined by the groom. The words were plain enough if you read them carefully. A woman who tried to leave would owe a debt she could never repay, bound to work it off under terms set entirely by the man who held the contract. It was not marriage. It was purchase. Dressed in legal language and sealed with territorial ink. The second contract was her own, Lenora Summerfield of Ridgemont, Ohio. The same clause appeared in the same paragraph, word for word, like a trap that had been set and sprung once before and was now baited again with fresh promises. Her hands trembled as she copied the relevant passages onto a piece of paper she had brought in her reticule. The clerk did not notice. He was busy with his own filing, the dull work of a man who recorded the machinery of other people's lives without ever examining the gears. She walked back to the ranch in the failing light of late afternoon, the copied documents folded tight in her pocket, pressing against her hip with every step like a second heartbeat. The fields stretched out on either side of the road, golden with the last of the season's grass, and the sky above was the deep, clear blue that comes only in September, when summer has not yet fully surrendered but knows its time is almost done. She had come to Cedar Ridge as a woman running from one disaster. Now she carried proof of another, larger one. Ogden Hale had not abandoned her out of carelessness or changed plans. He had left her on that porch deliberately, strategically, allowing desperation to soften her for the taking. He had done it before with Mary Thorne. He would do it again with the next woman desperate enough to answer his advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. And Virgil Skaggs, who had known about Lenora's presence at the Colburn Ranch almost before the dust had settled on her arrival, who had ridden out to deliver Hale's version of events with the precision of a man executing a plan rather than spreading gossip. Skaggs was not simply a troublesome neighbor. He was part of it. Lenora climbed the porch steps as the first stars appeared above the ridge line. Through the kitchen window, she could see Dorothea setting the table for supper, her movements efficient and familiar. Winifred was at the stove, stirring something that smelled of onions and sage. Jed's hat hung on its peg by the door, which meant he had already come in from the barn. Inside that kitchen was warmth and bread and the closest thing to family she had known since leaving Ohio. Inside her pocket was a piece of paper that could protect her but might destroy everything these people had built. She stood on the porch in the gathering darkness, one hand on the door handle, the other pressed against the folded documents over her heart, and faced the question that would determine everything that came next. Tell them, and risk dragging the Colburns into a fight they did not choose. Or stay silent and face Hale alone when he inevitably came to collect what he believed was his. The door opened from inside. Jed stood in the lamplight, his expression shifting from greeting to concern as he read something in her face. "Lenora, what happened?" She looked at him. At his steady eyes and his work-roughened hands and the lines of worry that had appeared around his mouth in the weeks since she had arrived, lines she had helped put there simply by existing in his world. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All of you. Tonight." And the look on his face as he stepped aside to let her in told her that whatever came next, she would not face it standing on a porch alone. But even as she crossed the threshold into the warm kitchen where Dorothea and Winifred looked up from their work with questioning eyes, even as she reached into her pocket for the documents that would change everything, Lenora could not stop thinking about a name written in a shopkeeper's ledger. Mary Thorne, March 14th, 1880. Needle and thread. 1 spool white cotton. 1 cake of soap. A woman who had been real and alive and full of hope, reduced to a single line of commerce in a book that nobody read. And somewhere out there, either free or not free, either alive or not alive, Mary Thorne was waiting for someone to remember that she had existed. Lenora intended to be that someone, but first she had to survive the storm that was coming. Because Ogden Hale was not a man who lost his property quietly. And Virgil Skaggs was not a man who let his investments go without a fight. And the Colburn family, with their dwindling savings and their damaged reputation and their stubborn, magnificent refusal to abandon a stranger they had taken in from the cold, was standing directly in the path of both. The truth laid bare. The kitchen fell silent when Lenora placed the copied documents on the scrubbed wooden table. The kerosene lamp cast its amber glow across the pages, illuminating the careful script she had transcribed from the county records with the precision of a woman who understood that words on paper could save a life or end one. Dorothea stood at the head of the table with her arms folded across her chest. Winifred sat in her usual chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold without her noticing. Jed leaned against the doorframe with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way he did when his thoughts were moving faster than his mouth could follow. Lenora told them everything. Mrs. Braddock's confession about Mary Thorne. The county records showing 2 contracts with identical clauses. The legal language designed to trap women into unpaid labor under the pretense of marriage debt. The deliberate absence at the train station. Not carelessness, but calculation. Not a man too busy to meet his bride, but a man who understood that desperation makes people accept terms they would never agree to with a full stomach and a clear mind. She spoke without emotion, laying out the facts the way she had once laid out grammar lessons for her students in Ridgemont. Subject, verb, object, cause, method, result. Her voice did not waver, though her hands trembled beneath the table where no one could see them. When she finished, the silence that filled the kitchen was not the comfortable kind. It was the silence of people recalculating the weight of what they carried, adjusting their grip on a burden that had just grown heavier. Dorothea spoke first. She unfolded her arms and placed both palms flat on the table, leaning forward with the deliberate intensity of a woman who had made hard decisions before and was preparing to make another one. So we do not run. We prepare. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that touched each person differently. Winifred straightened in her chair. Jed stopped turning his hat. Lenora felt something shift in her chest, a tightness she had been carrying since the county records office loosening just enough to let her draw a full breath. Jed looked at Lenora with an expression she had not seen before. Not pity, not the worried concern of a man who had taken in a stray and was beginning to regret it. Something closer to the look a person gives when they realize the stranger they invited to dinner turns out to speak the same language. You found all of this on your own. It was not a question. Lenora met his gaze. I am accustomed to finding my own answers when no one else is willing to stand on my side of the question. The words came out with an edge she had not intended, carrying the residue of a courtroom in Ohio where 5 men refused to meet her eyes. Jed heard it. She saw the recognition move across his face like a shadow crossing open ground. Dorothea gathered the documents and folded them with the careful movements of someone handling evidence rather than paper. She opened the tin box on the kitchen shelf, the one with the small brass lock where she kept the deed to the ranch and Emmett's death certificate and the other documents that form the legal skeleton of her family's existence. The copied pages went inside. The lock clicked shut. We keep these safe. When the time comes, they will speak for us. That night, Lenora lay in her narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her. The timbers creaked as they cooled. A mouse scratched behind the walls. Outside, an owl called from the barn roof, its cry carrying across the yard in the still air. She had given the Colburns everything she knew. And they had not flinched. They had not asked her to leave. They had not weighed the cost of keeping her against the price of letting her go and found her wanting. She pressed her face into the pillow that smelled of lavender and let herself feel, just for a moment, what it was like to be believed. The Cedar Ridge Gazette arrived at the Mercantile on Thursdays. 4 pages of territorial news, cattle prices, and advertisements printed on paper so thin you could read both sides at once. Lenora did not see the article herself. It was Winifred who brought the paper home from town, her face the color of skimmed milk, her hands clenching the pages so tightly that the ink smudged against her palms. The article occupied a single column on the second page, squeezed between an advertisement for Dr. Pemberton's restorative tonic and a notice about a missing mule. It did not name Lenora directly. It did not need to. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, where everyone knew everyone else's business better than they knew their own prayers, the references were as clear as a pointing finger. A former school teacher dismissed from her position in Ohio under circumstances of moral and financial impropriety has taken residence with a local family, raising questions about the judgment of those who offer shelter without proper inquiry into the character of those they harbor. Concerned citizens are reminded that the moral fabric of our community is only as strong as the weakest thread permitted to remain in the weave. Lenora read it standing in the kitchen doorway. The paper trembled in her hands, and she watched the words blur and sharpen as her eyes refused to hold steady. Moral impropriety. The phrase tasted like rust and old shame, and for a moment she was back in the school board room in Ridgemont, standing before men who had already decided she was guilty, feeling the ground dissolve beneath her feet. Then she folded the paper and set it on the table with the care of someone putting down something hot. She did not cry. She went to the writing desk in her room and pulled out paper and ink. The pen scratched steadily as she composed a letter to her sister Margaret in Ohio, the words precise and purposeful. Dear Maggie, I need you to do something for me. Go to the Ridgemont schoolhouse and ask Mrs. Fairbanks for my teaching certificate. It should still be in the records office unless Aldrich has destroyed it. Also, ask the Pennington family, the Hargraves, and old Mr. Whitaker if they would write letters confirming my character and my service as their children's teacher. I know this is a great deal to ask. I would not ask if it were not necessary. Your sister, Lenora. She sealed the letter and placed it in her reticule. When she returned to the kitchen, Jed was standing by the window reading the newspaper article. He looked up at her approach, and something dangerous moved behind his eyes, the kind of quiet fury that lives in men who do not raise their voices because they understand that the softest sounds can carry the most force. What do you need? He asked. Time. And the post office. He nodded once and did not ask for explanations. The trust in that silence, the willingness to let her fight her own battle while making clear he would stand beside her if she asked, settled into Lenora's chest like a warm stone placed against a bruise. Morrison cut off all credit to the Colburn Ranch the following week. The church sent a letter suggesting the family reconsider decisions that might affect the moral standing of the congregation. 2 neighbors who had previously hired Lenora to mend their clothes sent word through intermediaries that her services were no longer required. The circle of their world drew tighter with each passing day, squeezed by hands they could not see, but whose fingerprints were everywhere. Lenora watched Dorothea absorb each blow with the stoicism of a woman who had buried a son and kept standing. But she noticed things. The way Dorothea's hand paused over the sugar jar before deciding they could do without sweetened coffee for another week. The way she mended the same apron twice, rather than cut fabric for a new one. The way her evening prayers grew longer, spoken in a murmur so low that only God and the kitchen walls could hear them. The first truly cold night of autumn arrived in the third week of October, carrying with it a wind that rattled the windows and sent the barn door banging against its frame until Jed went out to secure it. Lenora sat on the front porch after supper, wrapped in the shawl Dorothea had lent her, watching the last light drain from the sky like water from a cracked vessel. She had not intended to stay outside. She had come to check whether the chickens were properly shut in for the night. But the porch held her the way certain places do when you need to think and cannot do it within four walls. She heard the door open and close behind her, felt rather than saw Jed settle onto the other end of the porch bench, leaving the respectful distance between them that had become their unspoken geography. For a long while, neither spoke. The wind moved through the prairie grass with a sound like breathing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to companions that may or may not have been listening. "Emmett died on a Tuesday," Jed said. The words arrived without preamble, as though they had been sitting in his throat for months and had simply chosen this moment to walk out on their own. I was in Prescott, 40 miles away, buying quinine from the only pharmacist who had it in stock. The fever had been burning through him for 4 days, and Doc Harlan said the quinine was his only chance. Jed's hands rested on his knees, motionless. I rode through the night, pushed that horse harder than I have ever pushed an animal in my life. The medicine bottles kept clinking in my saddlebag. Like bells at a funeral I did not know I was riding toward. He paused. The wind filled the space between his words. I got home 2 hours too late. Winifred was crying in the bedroom. I could hear her from the yard. And His voice did not break. It did something worse. It went flat, empty. Like a field after the harvest when everything that was alive has been cut down to stubble. I stood in the barn until morning, could not make myself go inside, because as long as I stayed in the barn, as long as I did not walk through that door and see the empty bed, it was not real yet. He was still alive in Prescott, where I had last seen him, sitting up and telling me to ride safe. His hands had begun to grip his knees, knuckles white against the dark fabric of his trousers. Not crying. Something beyond crying. The exhaustion of a man who had carried a stone inside his chest for a year and was only now admitting that it was there. I did not say goodbye to my brother. I stood in a barn and listened to his wife grieve through a closed door, because I was too much of a coward to face what I already knew. Lenora did not reach for him, did not offer the hollow comfort of words that could not hold the weight of what he had just laid down between them. She sat with his grief, the way you sit with a wounded animal, still and present, letting it know through silence that it is not alone. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than the wind. In Ridgemont, after the hearing, I walked home through town, 3 blocks, past the bakery where I bought bread every Saturday, past the church where I taught Sunday school, past the house where my best student lived, a girl named Ada who wanted to be a doctor. Not one person looked at me. Not one person stopped. It was as though I had already ceased to exist. And the worst part was not the accusation or the injustice. The worst part was that I had spent years believing I belonged in that town, and it took 11 minutes for them to prove I never had. She felt Jed turn toward her in the darkness. I did not beg them to believe me, she continued. I stood there, and I listened to the verdict, and I did not say a single word in my own defense. Would it have helped? No. That is why I am here. The words hung between them like breath visible in cold air, real and temporary, and impossible to take back. Eleanora felt the shape of the conversation change, felt it shift from two people sitting on a porch to two people standing at the edge of something they had not yet named. Jed extended his hand, not reaching for her, simply opening his palm on the bench between them, an offering without demand. Eleanora looked at that hand in the thin moonlight, steady as a promise made by someone who understood the cost of breaking one. She placed her hand on his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and rough and impossibly gentle. They sat that way for a long time, saying nothing. The coyote called again, closer now. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the chimney. Above them, the stars arranged themselves in the ancient patterns that had watched over every act of courage and cowardice since the first human heart learned to ache. When Eleanora finally rose to go inside, Jed spoke one word. Nora. She stopped, turned. He had never called her that before. Never anything but Miss Summerfield in public and Eleanora in the kitchen when conversation required a name. But this was different. This was the sound of a man choosing to hold something precious, carefully, in the most careful part of his voice. He did not say anything else, just nodded. Good night. But the way her name sounded in his mouth, tender and deliberate and new, changed the air between them in a way that could not be unchanged. The days that followed carried a different quality of light. Not brighter exactly, but clearer, as though the conversation on the porch had wiped clean a window that both of them had been looking through without realizing it was dirty. Jed built a small bookshelf in Eleanora's room. He did not announce it or ask permission or make a ceremony of the gesture. She simply returned from gathering eggs one morning to find it standing against the wall beside her bed, constructed from leftover pine boards sanded smooth as silk, fitted together with the dovetail joints of a man who understood that the things you build for someone reveal what you cannot bring yourself to say. She stood in the doorway and pressed her fingertips against the topmost shelf, feeling the grain of the wood, and understood that this was his language, not words, not declarations, but something constructed and solid and meant to last. She began teaching Lucy Braddock to read on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, sitting at the Colburn kitchen table with a primer she had carried from Ohio and a patience that seemed bottomless. Lucy was 7, bright as a new penny, and hungry for letters the way Eleanora herself had once been hungry for food. Within a week, 2 more children appeared at the door. Their mothers had heard about the lessons and decided that whatever the gossip said about Miss Summerfield's morals, the woman could teach. And good teaching was harder to find than good reputation in a territory where both were scarce. Jed and Eleanora laughed together for the first time on a Thursday afternoon when one of Dorothea's hens escaped the coop and landed squarely on the older woman's head during feeding time. The hen flapped and squawked. Dorothea swatted at it with her apron, her face set in an expression of such stern outrage that it might have been carved from granite. Winifred covered her mouth. Jed turned away. Eleanora pressed her lips together so hard they ached, and when the hen finally launched itself off Dorothea's head with a final indignant screech, all 3 of them lost the battle simultaneously. Laughter poured out of them like water from an overturned bucket, helpless and cleansing and warm. Dorothea brushed feathers from her hair and fixed them with a look that would have curdled fresh milk. But Eleanora caught the ghost of a twitch at the corner of the older woman's mouth. A crack in the granite. A tiny green shoot pushing up through stone. The mornings grew colder. Jed left a new shawl on the back of Leonora's kitchen chair one evening without comment. Wool, dark blue, warm enough to turn the October wind. She found it when she came down for breakfast, folded neatly over the chair where she always sat. He was already in the barn. She wrapped it around her shoulders and felt the warmth of a gesture that asked for nothing in return. Winifred noticed. She said nothing at first, but later, when they were alone, hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the sheets snapping in the wind like sails on a landlocked ship, she leaned close. He has not built anything for anyone since Emmett died. That bookshelf was the first thing. And now, the shawl. She pinned a pillowcase to the line with a wooden clip, her eyes on the horizon. My husband used to say that Jed speaks with his hands because his heart is too full for his mouth to hold it all. I did not understand what he meant until I watched Jed with you. Leonora pulled a damp sheet from the basket and shook it out. The fabric caught the wind and billowed like a white flag. She did not respond because some truths are too large to acknowledge with words and too fragile to examine in direct light. That evening, after supper, Leonora noticed Dorothea sitting at the kitchen table with a small pile of coins arranged before her like a failed card hand. Silver and copper catching the lamplight as the older woman's weathered fingers moved across them, counting and recounting with the desperate precision of someone watching their future contract with each tally. $23.40. That was all that remained after the bank payment and what Morrison had demanded up front for the winter feed order. Dorothea's lips moved as she counted, forming numbers that added up to not enough. Leonora froze in the doorway. The basket of mended shirts clutched against her chest left wicker marks on her palms. Dorothea looked up, and for one unguarded moment their eyes met across the kitchen. The older woman's face held nothing of its usual composure. What Leonora saw there was fear. The quiet, relentless fear of a woman who has spent her life building something and can hear the foundations beginning to crack. Leonora. Dorothea swept the coins into her apron pocket with a practiced motion, the metal clinking like broken bells. How was the mending? Fine, ma'am. Mrs. Patterson's shirts are ready for return. They held each other's gaze for a beat too long, both of them knowing what the other knew, both of them pretending they did not. That night, Leonora sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. The bookshelf stood against the wall. The blue shawl hung on its peg. Through the window, moonlight fell across the yard where the chickens slept, and the apple trees stood heavy with fruit, and the barn rose solid against the stars. This family was bleeding, slowly and quietly, the way proud people bleed, behind closed doors and over kitchen tables after the lamps have been turned low. Morrison's refusal to extend credit, the lost mending customers, the whisper campaign that had turned Cedar Ridge from a community into a siege. Every cut traced back to the same source, and the source was her. She knelt beside the bed and pulled her traveling bag from beneath it. The leather corners scraped against the rough wooden floor with a sound like something sharp being drawn across skin. The bag fell open, releasing the faint scent of lavender sachets that Maggie had tucked between her spare dress and her Bible back in Ohio, back when hope still smelled like something you could carry in your luggage. Leonora began to fold her clothes. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frame. The candle on her nightstand guttered and threw wild shadows across the walls. On the shelf that Jed had built with his own hands, her 3 books stood in a row, their spines catching the unsteady light. She pulled them down and placed them in the bag, then her pen and ink, then the small wooden box where she kept Maggie's letters, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue and was now the color of old rain. She was packing, and this time she was not waiting for anyone to stop her. The letter of leaving. The farewell letter took 4 attempts. The first was too angry, full of accusations against Ogden Hale and the unfairness of a world that punished women for the sins of men who wore their cruelty like Sunday clothes. She read it back and heard bitterness where she wanted gratitude, and tore it into pieces small enough to feed the stove. The second groveled. It apologized for existing, for taking up space, for eating food that should have gone to people who had earned the right to sit at that table. She read it and tasted the same bile that had risen in her throat during the school board hearing in Ridgemont. The sour flavor of a woman trying to make herself small enough to be forgiven for the crime of being wronged. That one she crumpled into a ball and threw against the wall, where it bounced off the bookshelf Jed had built and rolled beneath the bed like a wounded thing seeking darkness. The third attempted reason. She laid out the economics of reputation in a frontier town, the mathematics of gossip, the compound interest of shame. She calculated what her presence was costing the Colburn Ranch in lost business and damaged relationships, and presented the figures with the clinical precision of a ledger entry. But the numbers, accurate as they were, missed the point entirely. You cannot quantify what it means to be kept by people who chose you, and you cannot put a dollar amount on the cost of walking away from the first place that felt like home, since your mother died and your father followed her into the ground 6 months later, and your sister held your hand at both funerals and whispered, "We still have each other," which was true and also not enough. The fourth letter simply told the truth. Dear Dorothea, Jedediah, and Winifred, thank you for showing me what family means when it is built on choice rather than blood. I cannot repay that gift with anything except heartache, but I can prevent my presence from destroying what you have built with your own hands and honest sweat. A woman's reputation in a place like this is like a cracked mirror. Once broken, it spreads its damage to everything it reflects. Please know that leaving is the hardest thing I have ever done, but staying would be the cruelest. With deepest gratitude and love, Lenora. She folded the letter with hands that trembled like cottonwood leaves in a storm and placed it on the small wooden table beside her bed. Next to the letter, she set something else. The tin cup. The dented, scratched, worthless tin cup that she had carried from the train station to Braddock's porch to the Colburn Ranch. The cup that had held nothing but dew and desperation on the worst nights of her life. She placed it on the table like an offering at an altar, the last piece of the woman she had been when she arrived in Cedar Ridge, and turned away from it. The candle flame danced in the draft from the window. Shadows writhed on the walls. Lenora latched her traveling bag, the brass fittings clicking shut with a sound that was too small for something so final. She left before dawn. The kitchen was dark and cold, the stove's embers barely glowing. She crossed the floor in stocking feet, carrying her shoes in one hand and her bag in the other, stepping over the board near the pantry that creaked when you put weight on it. She had memorized the geography of this kitchen the way she had memorized everything about this house, the sounds it made, the way light fell through its windows, the smell of bread rising and coffee brewing and wood smoke curling from the chimney in the still morning air. She had memorized it all without meaning to, the way your heart memorizes the things it knows it is about to lose. The 3 miles to Cedar Ridge passed beneath her feet in darkness. Stars faded overhead as the eastern sky turned from black to the deep blue of a bruise just beginning to form. Her bag grew heavier with each step, though it contained less than it had when she arrived. She had left behind the shawl. She had left behind the books on the shelf Jed built. She had left behind the sourdough starter she had been tending for 6 weeks, feeding it flour and water each morning with the faithful regularity of someone tending a small, living prayer. She had left behind everything that mattered, which was, of course, the point. The mercantile was still shuttered when she reached town. She found the storage shed behind the building, its door unlocked, its interior smelling of burlap and old potatoes, and the particular loneliness of places where no one stays on purpose. She sat on a crate in the corner, set her bag at her feet, and pulled the tin cup from her coat pocket. She had taken it after all. She had placed it on the table as a farewell, then picked it up again at the last moment, slipping it into her pocket without understanding why. Now she held it in both hands in the thin gray light that leaked through the shed's plank walls, turning it slowly, feeling the dents and scratches beneath her fingers like a language written in Braille. This cup had been her entire world once. 3 pennies and an empty vessel on a stranger's porch. She was back to the same cup and the same aloneness, except that this time, the emptiness was not in her stomach. It was everywhere else. She cried then. Not the controlled, silent tears of a woman maintaining dignity in public. These were the tears of someone who had learned the exact dimensions of what she was losing because she had held it close enough to feel its warmth. She pressed the cup against her chest and let the grief pour out of her in the dark shed where nobody could see, and the sound she made was not loud, but it was deep, coming from the place where hope lives when it has nowhere else to go. Morning came to the Colburn Ranch the way it always did, with the rooster's cry and the pale light creeping across the kitchen floor. Dorothea was the first to find the empty room. She stood in the doorway and looked at the stripped bed, the vacant pegs on the wall, the letter on the table beside the bare bookshelf where 3 books had stood the night before. She picked up the letter and read it once, quickly, her lips moving slightly with each word. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you reread the last page of something you are not ready to finish. She walked to the kitchen and placed the letter on the table in front of Jed's plate. He was coming through the back door with the milk pail, steam rising from the warm liquid in the cold morning air, and the look on his mother's face stopped him mid-stride. He read the letter standing up. Dorothea watched his face the way you watch a landscape during a storm, tracking the changes as they move across the terrain. First confusion, then understanding. Then something she had not seen in her son since the night Emmett died, something breaking open behind his eyes. He set the milk pail on the counter with exaggerated care, as though the simple act of putting down a bucket required all the control he possessed. He walked to the back porch, sat on the top step, put his head in his hands. "I let her go, Ma." Dorothea followed him to the doorway. Morning light fell across her son's bent shoulders, and for a moment she saw not the 28-year-old man who ran her ranch, but the small boy who had brought her a dead bird once, cupped in his hands, and asked her to fix it. Same as I let Emmett go. Standing in the wrong place, while the people I should have fought for slipped away. Dorothea crossed the porch and placed her hand on her son's shoulder. 40 years on the frontier had taught her that tenderness was a risk she rarely took. But she took it now, and the weight of her hand there, firm and warm and deliberate, said everything her voice could not. Emmett died, Jedediah. That was God's doing, not yours. Lenora chose to leave. That is her doing. Two different things entirely. She paused, her fingers tightening on his shoulder. Question is, are you going to sit on this porch, or are you going to go find her and give her a reason to choose differently? Jed raised his head. His eyes were dry but raw, scrubbed clean by something harsher than tears. Do not drag her back, Dorothea said as he stood. Give her a reason to stay. There is a difference, and she is the kind of woman who will know which one you are doing. He was saddling his horse when Winifred appeared at the barn door. She stood with one hand resting against the frame, the other pressed flat against her stomach in a gesture so instinctive and unguarded that it stopped Jed's hands on the cinch strap. Bring her home, Winifred said simply. And the way she said home, with the full weight of a woman who understood what it meant to lose the people you loved most from a house that still held their ghost, told Jed everything he needed to know about what Lenora's absence had already cost them. He found her in the shed behind Braddock's Mercantile. The door was ajar, and the light inside was gray and thin. She sat on a crate with her bag at her feet and the tin cup in her hands, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were swollen but steady, the eyes of a woman who had finished crying and was now waiting to see what came next. Jed did not speak immediately. He stepped inside the shed, ducked beneath a beam, and lowered himself to sit on the crate opposite hers. Their knees nearly touched in the narrow space. The shed smelled of burlap and earth, and through the gaps in the walls, thin lines of morning light fell across them both like the bars of a cage made of gold. If you want to go, he said, that is your right, and I will respect it. But do not go, because you are afraid of being a burden to people who never once thought of you that way. Do not go because Virgil Skaggs and Ogden Hale made you believe you are the cause of trouble that they created. If you go, go because you truly want to, not because you think leaving is the brave thing. He paused. Sometimes staying is braver. Lenora looked at him, at his face in the thin light, drawn and sleepless, carrying the evidence of a night spent in the company of her absence. Your family cannot afford the cost of keeping me. I saw the coins on the table, Jedediah. I heard Morrison refuse your mother credit. I watched the church close its doors. Every bit of that is because of me. Every bit of that is because of Hale and Skaggs. You are the target, not the cause. And my family voted on this weeks ago. 3 hands went up. Ma's, gnarled with arthritis but steady as stone. Winifred's, smaller but no less determined. And mine. He held up his own hand in the dim light, scarred from rope and wire and the honest labor of a life spent building things that lasted. You are missing the 4th vote, yours. The tin cup turned slowly in Lenora's fingers. She looked down at it, at the dents and scratches that mapped the topography of her worst days, and then she looked up at the man who had sat on a stranger's porch and shared his supper with her without asking for anything in return. There is something else you should know, she said. Deputy Loomis may already be looking for me. Ogden Hale filed a complaint. Breach of contract and theft of property. She watched the news hit him, the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, but not surprise. Whatever Jed Colburn had expected from Hale, this fell within the boundaries of it. Then you need to be at that ranch when he comes, not hiding in a shed. I am not hiding. I am protecting the people who protected me. You are running. And I say that with respect, because I have done enough running of my own to recognize the sound of it. The words stung because they were true. Lenora had been running since Ridgemont, running from Aldrich's lie, running from the school board's judgment, running from a town that had erased her as efficiently as chalk from a blackboard. She had run all the way to Cedar Ridge and into the arms of a family that refused to let her go, and now she was running again. And the only difference was that this time she knew exactly what she was leaving behind. She looked at the cup in her hands, then at Jed, then at the door of the shed, where morning light was growing stronger, pushing back the shadows. Your mother said something to me the day after church. She said she kept me because my bread reminded her of her mother's, and because you smiled again. Jed's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes that he did not try to hide. She said that? She did. And I have been thinking about it ever since. About what it means to be kept, not because of what you can do, but because of what you bring to a table just by sitting down at it. She stood. The crate scraped against the dirt floor. She picked up her bag, and for a moment Jed thought she was about to walk out the door and down the road and out of his life with the same quiet determination she brought to everything she did, but instead she turned to face him. I will come back, but not because you asked, because those documents are in your mother's tin box, and tomorrow morning I intend to stand in a courtroom and use them. The ride back to the ranch passed in a silence that was neither comfortable nor strained, but something new altogether. A silence between two people who had said the hardest things they knew how to say, and were resting in the aftermath like travelers resting after a steep climb. Deputy Loomis arrived an hour after they returned. His horse was lathered and his badge caught the midday sun as he dismounted with the practiced efficiency of a lawman delivering news he wished belonged to someone else's jurisdiction. Looking for Lenora Summerfield. Got a formal complaint from Ogden Hale. Breach of marriage contract and theft of property. She is to appear before Judge Parcher at the Territorial Courthouse tomorrow morning at 10 sharp. Lenora stood on the porch with the Colburns flanking her, Dorothea on her right, Winifred on her left, Jed one step behind, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against her back. And if she does not appear, Jed asked, then I come back with a warrant. Loomis refolded the paper and touched his hat. Nothing personal, just doing my job. Behind him, visible at the far end of the road, two riders sat their horses in the fading light. Even at that distance, Lenora recognized the rigid posture of Ogden Hale and the wide-brimmed hat of Virgil Skaggs. They did not approach. They did not need to. Their presence was the message, and the message was clear. After the deputy left, Lenora sat on the porch steps, with her knees drawn to her chest. The evening sounds of the ranch surrounded her. Chickens settling, cattle lowing, wind through grass, normal sounds, safe sounds, sounds that belonged to a life she had almost thrown away that morning in a shed that smelled of old potatoes. I have to face him, she said. In that courtroom, with what I found. Dorothea sat beside her, the wooden step creaking under their weight. Not alone, you do not. The next morning dawned gray and overcast. Lenora stood before the small mirror in her room, pinning her hair with fingers that refused to steady. She had chosen her best dress, the dark blue wool with pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and cedar, scents that carried her back to a kitchen in Ohio where a woman with flour on her hands had taught her daughter that bread and backbone were made the same way, with patience, pressure, and the refusal to collapse. Dorothea appeared in the doorway holding a paisley shawl so old and fine that it might have crossed the plains in a covered wagon. "This belonged to my mother. Wore it to my own wedding 42 years ago." Leonora's throat closed as Dorothea draped the shawl around her shoulders with the tenderness of a mother dressing her daughter for battle. The wool was soft as whispered prayer, warm as an embrace, as from someone who had been dead for 20 years, but whose love had outlived her bones. "We chose you," Dorothea said, her hands resting for a moment on Leonora's shoulders. "We stand by that, come what may." They walked into Cedar Ridge as a family. Dorothea on Leonora's right, Winifred on her left, Jed behind them with his shoulders squared and his Sunday coat brushed clean. The morning sun cast long shadows, and Leonora could feel eyes watching from every window. The courthouse was a simple wooden building with a bell tower and a flag hanging limp in the still air. Judge Parcher's courtroom occupied the entire first floor. Ogden Hale sat in the front row, his suit pressed sharp, his boots polished to mirrors. When Leonora entered, he turned to stare at her with the cold assessment of a man cataloging property. "Miss Summerfield, you stand accused of breach of contract and theft of property. How do you answer?" Leonora rose on legs that felt thin as water. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Hale's lawyer presented the case with theatrical precision, reading each clause of the contract as though it were scripture. The courtroom murmured. Neighbors who had avoided Leonora's eyes for weeks now stared openly, their faces a gallery of judgment. "Miss Summerfield, do you have legal representation?" Silence. Leonora opened her mouth, and nothing came. "I will speak for her." Every head turned. Dorothea Colburn stood in the gallery, gray hair pinned severe, hands gripping her reticule. "I am qualified to speak God's truth, Your Honor. And the truth is that Ogden Hale abandoned this woman at the train station, left her with no money, no shelter, and no explanation for 3 days while decent folk walked past her like she was already in her grave." Hale leaped to his feet. "That is a lie. I was delayed by urgent business." 3 days of business, Dorothea's voice cut through the room like a blade, while a decent woman sat hungry on a store porch with 3 pennies and a tin cup. The courtroom stirred. Judge Parcher rapped his gavel. But even as Dorothea's words echoed off the walls, Leonora could see the judge weighing law against righteousness, and the law was heavier. Dorothea's speech was not enough. Leonora stood. The movement was small, but it drew every eye in the room, the way a single match draws attention in a dark field. She reached into her reticule and withdrew the documents she had copied from the county records office. Her hands no longer trembled. Something had settled in her. A calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to walk through it. "Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence." She laid the papers before Judge Parcher and spoke in the clear, measured voice of a schoolteacher addressing a classroom. She described the 2 contracts, the identical clauses, the legal trap designed to convert marriage into servitude. She spoke the name Mary Thorne and watched it fall into the courtroom like a stone into a still pond. "Mr. Hale did not seek a wife, Your Honor. He designed a mechanism for acquiring unpaid labor disguised as matrimony. He left me at the station deliberately, knowing that a woman stranded without resources would be more compliant when he eventually appeared to collect her." From the 3rd row, Mrs. Braddock rose to her feet. Her face was pale, but set with the determination of a woman who had carried a secret long enough to know its exact weight. 2 years ago, a girl named Mary Thorne sat on my porch the same way Miss Summerfield did. I gave her water and a blanket, and told myself it was none of my concern. Hale came for her on the 6th day. I never saw her again. Her voice cracked but held. I have been silent too long. I will not be silent again. Near the back of the courtroom, old Mr. Fenwick pushed himself upright with his cane. I remember that girl. Her name was Mary. She had a green traveling coat. A murmur moved through the gallery. Then another voice. Then another. The community was not turning like a flock of birds wheeling in unison. It was turning the way soil turns after a long freeze, slowly and with effort, one hard clod at a time. Judge Parcher studied the documents, studied Eleanora, studied Hale, whose face had gone the color of dirty snow. This court finds that the marriage contract was voided by the plaintiff's failure to fulfill his primary obligations. Miss Summerfield is free to make her own choices about her future. Furthermore, this court orders an investigation into the contracts and business dealings of Ogden Hale. The gavel cracked like thunder. Leonora's knees buckled and she sank into her chair. Around her, she heard Dorothea whisper, "Praise the Lord," and Winifred exhale as though she had been holding her breath since morning, and somewhere behind her, Jed stood motionless, but she could feel his presence the way you feel sunlight on your back, warm and steady and certain. The courtroom emptied slowly. People filed out in clusters, already weaving the morning's events into the stories they would tell over supper tables for weeks to come. Leonora gathered her documents with careful hands and walked toward the door where her family waited. She paused at the threshold. Ogden Hale stood near the back entrance, alone. His lawyer had already left. Skaggs was nowhere to be seen. Hale's face held no anger. What Leonora saw there was worse. Emptiness. The flat, hollow expression of a man who had built his life on the weakness of others and had just watched the foundation crack. Leonora stopped in front of him, not close, but close enough to be heard. "I hope someone finds Mary Thorne." Hale said nothing. His eyes flickered, and in that flicker, Leonora saw something she had not expected. Not remorse exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man looking at a wall he had thought was made of paper and discovering it was made of stone. She walked past him and through the courthouse door and into the November sunlight where Jed and Dorothea and Winifred stood waiting. The light fell across their faces, and for the first time since leaving Ridgemont, Ohio, Leonora Summerfield walked forward without looking behind her. Harvest moon and new ground. 3 weeks after the courthouse doors closed behind her, Leonora stood at the kitchen window watching Jed repair the fence around the expanded chicken coop. His hammer rang against the wooden post in a steady rhythm, each blow driving nails deeper into fresh-cut pine with the satisfaction of work done right. The autumn air carried the sweet scent of ripe apples from the orchard and the earthy smell of turned soil from the fields where they had finished harvesting the last of the wheat. The world had shifted in those 3 weeks. Not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of a river changing course, but slowly and certainly. The way seasons change when you are not watching closely enough to catch the exact moment green becomes gold. Ogden Hale left Cedar Ridge on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Leonora had arrived. He loaded his belongings onto a rented wagon and drove out of town before dawn, as though the darkness could hide what the courtroom had already exposed. The territorial marshal had opened an investigation. Letters were sent to Baltimore inquiring about Mary Thorne. The answers had not yet come, but the questions themselves had already done their work, pulling threads that Hale had spent years weaving into a fabric of false respectability. Virgil Skaggs stayed longer but fared no better. With Hale gone, the partnership that had sustained his ambitions collapsed like a fence with its corner posts removed. Neighbors who had tolerated his presence out of caution now avoided his company with the quiet efficiency of people who recognize a losing hand. His ranch, which he had leveraged against bank loans to finance the purchase of Colburn land that he would never own, went up for sale. No one made an offer. The sign stood at the end of his road for weeks, weathering in the autumn rain, until even the paint began to bleed away. Morrison came to the ranch on a Saturday morning. He drove his supply wagon up the road and parked it near the kitchen porch. And when Dorothea came to the door, he removed his hat and held it against his chest with both hands. He did not apologize with words exactly. Morrison was not a man built for the architecture of apology. But he extended credit again and added a sack of sugar to the order that Dorothea had not requested and did not pay for. Dorothea looked at the sugar and then at Morrison and then at the sugar again. Her expression did not change. She nodded once, short and definitive, as a period at the end of a long sentence, and carried the sack inside without comment. Forgiveness on the frontier did not look like absolution. It looked like a nod and an unrequested sack of sugar and the unspoken agreement to move forward without examining the past too closely. Mrs. Braddock began visiting on Thursday afternoons. She brought baked goods wrapped in cotton cloth and opinions wrapped in nothing at all, and she sat at the kitchen table with Dorothea drinking tea as though they had been doing it for decades rather than weeks. Two women who had chosen courage over comfort, sitting together in the warm kitchen while the autumn wind pushed against the windows. Eleanora watched them from the doorway sometimes, these two weathered sentinels who had stood up in their own ways and at their own costs, and understood that community is not built by people who agree on everything, but by people who decide that some things matter more than disagreement. The letter from Margaret arrived on a Wednesday. Eleanora saw the Ohio postmark and carried the envelope to her room before opening it, sitting on the edge of the bed with the afternoon light falling across the quilt. Inside, she found her original teaching certificate, the paper still crisp and official, stamped with the seal of the Ridgemont Board of Education. Beneath it lay 3 letters, each one folded separately and addressed in different hands. Mrs. Fairbanks, who had taught alongside Eleanora for 2 years, wrote that Miss Summerfield was the finest educator she had ever known, and that the school had not been the same since her departure. Mr. Pennington wrote that his daughter could read Shakespeare because of Eleanora, and that some people are too small to recognize goodness when it stands in front of them. Old Mr. Whitaker, whose grandchildren had been in Leonora's very first class, wrote a single line in handwriting that shook with age, but not with uncertainty. That girl was the best thing that ever happened to our school, and anyone who says different is a fool or a liar. Margaret had added her own note at the bottom of the envelope. They remember you, Nora. They always believed you. Eleanora held the letters against her chest and felt the wound that Ridgemont had carved into her begin to close. Not because the letters healed it, because she had stopped running from it. You cannot mend what you refuse to hold still, and for the first time since Aldrich's lie had upended her world, Eleanora held the broken thing steady in her hands and let it begin to knit. The teaching grew. Lucy Braddock came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and within a month, 2 more children joined her at the kitchen table, their faces bright with the particular hunger that comes from wanting to know things. Lenora taught them the way her mother had taught her to make bread, with patience and repetition, and the absolute conviction that the ingredients would rise if you gave them the right conditions. She taught them letters and numbers and the names of the states and the way sentences work when you put the words in the right order. And she discovered that teaching in a ranch kitchen with 4 students and a cast iron stove was not so different from teaching in a schoolhouse with 23 students and a pot-bellied heater. The work was the same. The joy was the same. The feeling of watching a child's face transform when a word on a page suddenly becomes a sound, and then a meaning, and then a world, was exactly the same. And it filled a part of her that had been empty for longer than she cared to measure. Jed built the room without announcement. Lenora came back from gathering eggs one morning and found him framing a new addition off the east side of the house, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows and sawdust in his hair. She stood in the yard with the egg basket on her hip and watched him work, his movements precise and unhurried, fitting each board into place with the care of someone who understood that the things you build should outlast the hands that build them. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew. She wanted to hear him say it. "Parlor. For the teaching when winter comes. Cannot have children walking 3 miles in snow just to sit in a drafty kitchen." He set a nail and drove it home with 2 clean strokes. Besides, a man ought to provide proper for his family. He did not say wife. He said family. And the way he said it, quiet and sure and without looking up from his work, told Lenora that the word had already expanded in his mind to include her. The way a house expands when you add a room, and suddenly the whole structure makes more sense than it did before. The evening Dorothea called Lenora her daughter was not an event. It was a moment so small and unremarkable that it almost slipped past without notice, the way the most important things often do. They were in the kitchen after supper, washing dishes side by side in water that smelled of lye soap and the day's work. Dorothea handed Lenora a clean towel and said, without particular emphasis or ceremony, "Lenora, go fetch more wood before the fire dies, and take the heavy coat. November does not forgive thin shawls." It was the first time Dorothea had used her first name without the formal distance of Miss Summerfield or the careful neutrality of you. Just Lenora. Said the way you say the name of someone who belongs in your house and your life and your daily vocabulary. Said the way you say daughter without using the word. Lenora took the coat from its hook and walked to the woodpile, and the November air hit her face like cold water, and she stood among the split logs for a long moment, breathing hard, because some kindnesses arrive so quietly that they break you open more completely than any cruelty ever could. The harvest moon rose full and golden on the last night of November. Lenora sat on the front porch swing, pushing it gently with her toe, the wooden seat creaking in a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The day's teaching was done. The bread was baked. The preserves lined the cellar shelves in rows of amber and ruby, enough to carry them through winter and into the spring beyond. Jed came up the porch steps and stood beside the swing with his hands on the whitewashed railing. "Mind if I sit?" She moved over. The swing dipped under his weight, bringing them close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Above them, the moon turned the yard to silver. "Been thinking," he said, "about more than chicken coops and parlor rooms." Lenora waited. She had learned that Jed's words arrived like his hammer strokes, deliberate and precise, and that rushing him produced nothing but silence. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in faded velvet. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the cloth, revealing a simple gold band that caught the moonlight and held it like captured fire. This was my grandmother's ring. Belonged to her mother before that, and her mother's mother before her. 4 generations of Colburn women wore it. It has been sitting in a drawer waiting for the right hand. Leonora's breath stopped. She looked at the ring, at the gold worn smooth by decades of wear, shaped by the fingers of women who had worked and loved and endured. I am not asking because I think you owe this family something. I am not asking out of gratitude or duty or because the neighbors expect it. His voice was steady, but his hands were not, and the contradiction between the two said more than any declaration could have. I am asking because somewhere between that first supper on Braddock's porch and watching you stand up in that courtroom, I realized I cannot imagine a life that does not have you in it. Leonora touched the ring with one fingertip. The gold was warm. As partners, she said, not as someone who needed rescuing. Jed's mouth curved into the half-smile she had come to love more than the sunrise. Partners. You never needed rescuing, Nora Summerfield. You rescued yourself the first night when you chose dignity over begging. All I did was offer a place to sit while you figured out your next step. She looked at his face in the golden light, at the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw and the steadiness that had been there since the first evening he shared his plate with a stranger. Yes. One word. Small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Large enough to hold a future. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though 4 generations of Colburn women had worn it smooth to prepare it for exactly this moment. Through the kitchen window, Leonora caught a glimpse of Dorothea and Winifred embracing, their faces bright with joy they had not bothered to hide. The sound of a cork popping carried through the glass, and then they were on the porch with elderberry wine in glasses that caught the moonlight. To new beginnings, Dorothea said. To family, Winifred added. To finding home where you least expect it, Leonora said, and her voice was thick, but her eyes were clear. They drank in the moonlight. 4 people who had become family through choice, bound by something stronger than contracts or blood or the opinions of neighbors who had taken longer than they should have to remember what decency looked like. Later, after Dorothea and Winifred had gone to bed, Leonora and Jed remained on the swing, planning the spring in quiet voices. The garden, the new hens, the parlor room that would become a schoolhouse when the snow came. Leonora looked out across the moonlit fields, the wheat stubble silver in the pale light, the apple trees bare now but holding the memory of fruit in their branches, the barn and the house and the new room taking shape on the east wall, all of it solid, all of it real, all of it earned. In the morning, she would place the dented tin cup on the kitchen windowsill. She would fill it with water and set inside it a sprig of goldenrod she had picked from the roadside, the last wild flower of autumn, yellow as hope and stubborn as the woman who carried it home. The cup that had once held nothing but dew and desperation would hold something living, something that bloomed, and on the table behind it, the primer would lie open to the first page, ready for Lucy Braddock and the other children who would arrive with cold cheeks and warm curiosity, ready to learn their letters from a woman who had traveled 1,500 miles to discover that the thing she was searching for had been inside her all along. Not a place, not a name, not even a man, though the man was a gift she had not dared to hope for. What she had been searching for was the right to choose where she stood and who she stood beside, and what she would build with the days she had been given. Lenora Summerfield chose Cedar Ridge. She chose the Colburns. She chose the porch swing and the sourdough starter, and the children who would fill the parlor room with the sound of new words spoken aloud for the first time. And Cedar Ridge, slowly and imperfectly, and with the stubborn grace of a community learning to be better than its worst instincts, chose her back. The harvest moon continued its ancient journey across the sky. The church bell chimed in the distance, and on a porch swing beneath the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds sat together in the comfortable silence of souls that had finally come home.